The hardest goodbyes are never spoken. They begin the moment someone chooses another place to call home. That was the thought running through my mind the night Ethan Cole knocked on my apartment door at exactly 2:17 in the morning. Rain poured against the windows hard enough to blur the city lights outside, and when I opened the door, I almost did not recognize him. His hair was soaked, his jacket clung to his shoulders, and in one trembling hand, he held a small velvet box that he seemed unable to let go of. I did not have to ask what had happened. Claire had left him. For months, Ethan had talked about proposing. He had spent weekends searching for the perfect ring, rehearsing speeches he pretended were jokes whenever he practiced them in front of me, and asking whether I thought she would like a mountain cabin or a beach for a future honeymoon. I smiled through every conversation because that was what best friends did. I buried every feeling that did not belong in the space between us and convinced myself that loving him quietly was enough. Now he stood on my doorstep looking like someone whose entire future had disappeared in a single evening. "Can I stay here tonight?" he asked, barely above a whisper. I stepped aside immediately. "You never have to ask." Ethan walked inside without another word. He placed the velvet box carefully on my kitchen counter before sinking onto the couch, as though every ounce of strength had finally abandoned him. I brought him a dry towel and one of my old sweatshirts while heating a kettle for tea. He thanked me automatically, but his eyes never left the rain outside the window. Nearly 20 minutes passed before he finally spoke again. "She said she stopped loving me months ago." His voice cracked just enough to reveal how desperately he had been trying to stay composed. I sat in the chair across from him instead of beside him, knowing he needed comfort without feeling crowded. "I am sorry," I said quietly. Ethan laughed once, but there was no happiness in the sound. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I shook my head. He looked down at the unopened ring box resting on the coffee table. I was planning forever while. She was already planning her exit. There was no answer that could make those words less painful, so I simply stayed. Sometimes silence carries more comfort than advice ever could. As dawn slowly approached, Ethan eventually fell asleep, sitting upright on my couch with the untouched cup of tea cooling beside him. Before turning off the living room lamp, I gently draped a blanket over his shoulders. His hand instinctively reached toward mine for only a second before relaxing again, still asleep. My heart reacted faster than my thoughts, and I quietly pulled my hand away before he could wake. Looking at him in that peaceful moment, it became painfully clear that I had been making the same mistake for years. I kept believing my feelings would eventually disappear if I ignored them long enough. Instead, they had only grown stronger with every ordinary day we spent together. The next morning, Ethan apologized for showing up without warning and promised he would leave after breakfast. I smiled and told him there was no rush. One night became 3. 3 days quietly became 2 weeks. His spare clothes slowly filled one drawer in my apartment. His favorite coffee mug somehow became part of my morning routine. Neither of us noticed when surviving heartbreak slowly transformed into building a life that felt strangely natural. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The night Ethan came to my door asking for a place to stay was supposed to last until sunrise. Neither of us realized we had already stepped into a chapter that would change both of our lives in ways neither of us was prepared to understand. The first few days followed a pattern neither of us planned. Ethan insisted he would only stay until he found the motivation to return to his own apartment, but every morning seemed to arrive before he was ready to face an empty place filled with memories of Claire. I never suggested that he remain longer. I simply made an extra cup of coffee, left clean towels on the bathroom shelf, and cleared enough space in the closet so he would not have to keep living out of a travel bag. The apartment slowly adjusted to having 2 people without either of us talking about it. His running shoes appeared beside mine near the front door. His favorite breakfast cereal quietly found a permanent place in my kitchen cabinet. Some evenings he cooked dinner while I edited photographs for clients, and other nights we ordered takeout because neither of us felt like pretending to be productive after long workdays. Nothing about those moments looked extraordinary, yet every ordinary routine felt strangely meaningful to me. Ethan rarely spoke about Claire during the day, but the nights were different. Around midnight, he often wandered into the living room, unable to sleep, carrying the same blanket he had used since his first night. We would sit by the window, overlooking the quiet streets below, while the city lights shimmered across the river. Sometimes he talked for an hour about everything that had gone wrong. Other times we watched traffic pass in complete silence. I never tried to convince him to move on before he was ready. I simply listened. One Saturday morning, I found him standing in my kitchen staring into the refrigerator without actually looking at anything. "You forgot breakfast again," I said gently. He shrugged without turning around. "I am just not hungry." I opened a cabinet, pulled out pancake mix, and placed it on the counter. "Then help me make too many pancakes." He looked at me with the first genuine smile I had seen all week. "Too many," I nodded. "That way we can complain about eating leftovers tomorrow." He laughed softly, and for a few precious minutes the sadness disappeared from his face. It became our quiet tradition after that. Every Saturday, we cooked breakfast together, arguing playfully about the right amount of maple syrup or whether blueberries belonged in pancakes. Those simple mornings slowly reminded Ethan what normal life felt like again. Weeks passed, and I began noticing small changes. He started answering calls from coworkers instead of ignoring them. He returned to the gym for the first time since the breakup. One afternoon, he surprised me by suggesting we take my camera and spend the evening walking through the downtown Riverwalk so I could capture the sunset. While I photographed reflections across the water, Ethan waited patiently beside me, occasionally pointing out interesting angles before I noticed them myself. "You always see things everyone else misses," he said quietly. I smiled without looking away from the camera. "That is part of being a photographer." He shook his head. "No, that is just who you are." Those words stayed with me long after we returned home. Later that night, after another exhausting day of rebuilding his confidence one small conversation at a time, Ethan fell asleep on the couch while we watched an old movie neither of us had been paying much attention to. As I reached for the remote to turn off the television, his hand found mine without warning. He never opened his eyes. He simply held on gently, as though somewhere between sleep and waking his heart already knew where it felt safest. I remained perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement might break the fragile peace surrounding us. For one impossible moment, it felt as though the life I had secretly imagined for years had quietly stepped into reality. Then, still half asleep, Ethan smiled faintly and whispered only one word before drifting deeper into sleep. "Home." After that night, the word Ethan whispered stayed with me far longer than I wanted to admit. Home. He never mentioned it the following morning, and I never asked whether he remembered saying it at all. Instead, we slipped back into the comfortable rhythm that had quietly become our everyday life. I woke before sunrise to edit photographs while he went for an early run through the neighborhood. By the time he returned, slightly out of breath with his cheeks flushed from the cool morning air, I already had coffee waiting on the kitchen counter. He always thanked me with the same grateful smile before asking about my latest photography project. Somewhere between those ordinary conversations, we stopped behaving like two friends sharing an apartment temporarily. We simply became two people naturally building a life around each other. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan suggested we visit a local farmer's market because he wanted to cook dinner from scratch. I laughed, reminding him that his idea of cooking usually involved grilling chicken and calling it gourmet. He rolled his eyes dramatically before insisting he had improved. We wandered through rows of fresh vegetables, homemade bread, flowers, and artisan foods while street musicians filled the sidewalks with soft acoustic music. Ethan carried every shopping bag before I even reached for one, claiming photographers needed to protect their shoulders. I teased him for acting overprotective, but secretly I enjoyed every effortless gesture. Later, while preparing dinner together, flour somehow ended up on both of us after Ethan unsuccessfully attempted to make homemade pasta. We laughed so hard that neither of us noticed how naturally the evening unfolded until dinner was already on the table. Looking across the apartment, it suddenly felt less like my home and more like ours. The following weekend, we visited a local animal shelter because Ethan said he missed having a dog around. We had only planned to spend an hour there, but one energetic golden retriever mix refused to leave Ethan's side. The dog followed him through every room, resting his head against Ethan's leg whenever he stopped walking. I smiled quietly. Looks like somebody already made his decision. Ethan knelt beside the dog, gently scratching behind his ears before looking at me with an expression I had not seen in months. It was genuine happiness. "Do you think this is a terrible idea?" he asked. I glanced between them before answering honestly. "I think sometimes the right things find us before we realize we are ready." 2 hours later, we walked out carrying adoption papers, a leash, and enough dog supplies to fill my car. That evening, the apartment echoed with excited barking, scattered tennis balls, and the sound of Ethan laughing more freely than he had since before his heartbreak. Watching him kneel on the living room floor while the dog eagerly chased every toy made me realize just how much he had healed. Days blended into weeks. Friends began joking that Ethan practically lived with me now. Neither of us corrected them because neither of us really knew where the temporary arrangement had ended. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a neighborhood cafe, the cashier looked at both of us before smiling warmly. "You two are back again," she said. "Still the usual order?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, please." As she prepared our drinks, she casually added, "You make a wonderful couple." Time seemed to pause. My heartbeat became impossibly loud. I instinctively looked toward Ethan, expecting him to laugh, correct her, or awkwardly explain that we were only best friends. Instead, he simply stood there holding the dog's leash, smiling quietly without saying a single word. We collected our coffees, thanked the cashier, and walked back onto the sidewalk in complete silence. He never corrected her. He never denied it. As the autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the street, hope quietly slipped into my heart for the first time in years, and I began wondering whether Ethan was finally starting to see the life we had already been living together. For the first time since Claire walked away, Ethan looked genuinely happy. The heaviness that had followed him into my apartment months earlier seemed to fade a little more each day, replaced by easy laughter, playful conversations, and a quiet confidence I had almost forgotten he possessed. Watching him heal should have been enough for me. After all, that was all I had ever wanted. Yet somewhere along the way, I stopped simply hoping he would be happy. I started hoping that maybe I was becoming part of the reason why. One Friday evening, Ethan surprised me by coming home earlier than usual carrying 2 paper bags from my favorite Italian restaurant. "No cooking tonight," he announced with a grin. "Your camera has been glued to your hands all week, and photographers deserve dinner too." I laughed as he unpacked our meals onto the kitchen table before opening a bottle of sparkling water. It was such a small gesture, but it felt strangely intimate. We ate slowly while talking about everything except the past. We debated which movies deserved a sequel, laughed about our overly energetic dog stealing socks whenever someone forgot to close the bedroom door, and planned a weekend hiking trip just outside the city. For a while, heartbreak seemed like something that belonged to another lifetime. After dinner, Ethan insisted on washing every dish despite my protests. I leaned against the kitchen counter watching him pretend to conduct an invisible orchestra with the dish towel while old songs played softly through the apartment speakers. "You know," I said, smiling despite myself, "you are much happier now than you were a few months ago." He turned toward me, his expression growing unexpectedly thoughtful. "That is because of you." The words landed gently but carried more weight than he probably realized. I looked away for a moment, afraid my face might reveal everything I had spent years hiding. Ethan dried his hands before walking over until only a few feet separated us. "You saved me, Mason," he said quietly. "When everything fell apart, you never tried to fix me. You just stayed." My heartbeat became painfully loud inside the silence. I wanted to tell him that staying had never been difficult because loving him had never been a choice. It had simply become part of who I was. Instead, I forced myself to smile. "That is what best friends do." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No, most people would have gotten tired of carrying someone else's sadness." Before I could answer, he reached into the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled down 2 mugs for hot chocolate. Another routine we had somehow created without discussing it. As we carried our drinks onto the apartment balcony, the city skyline shimmered beneath thousands of lights, while a cool evening breeze drifted between the buildings. Ethan rested his elbows against the railing beside me. "Sometimes I think about what my life would look like if I had met you first," he admitted. My breath caught in my chest. He continued before I could respond. "Everything feels easier when you are around. Safer. Quieter. I honestly do not know how I would have survived this year without you." Every word pulled me closer to saying what I had hidden for so long. My lips parted as I searched for the courage to finally tell him the truth. Then, before a single word could leave my mouth, the soft vibration of Ethan's phone broke the silence. He glanced down at the glowing screen. The warmth immediately disappeared from his face, replaced by complete disbelief. I quietly looked at the display and saw one name that instantly turned every hopeful thought inside me into quiet fear. Claire. Beneath her name were 6 simple words that changed the entire evening. Can we please talk? I am home. Neither of us slept well that night. After the message appeared on Ethan's phone, the easy warmth that had filled the apartment quietly disappeared, replaced by a silence neither of us knew how to cross. He never replied to Claire before going to bed, but I noticed him turning his phone over several times as though hoping the message might somehow vanish on its own. The following morning we sat across from each other at the kitchen table eating breakfast in near silence, while our dog rested peacefully between us, completely unaware that something had shifted. Finally, Ethan placed his coffee mug down and looked at me with tired eyes. She wants to meet this afternoon, he said softly. I nodded without pretending to be surprised. What are you thinking? He leaned back in his chair, running one hand through his hair exactly the way he always did whenever his thoughts became tangled. I honestly do not know. A few months ago, I would have driven across the city without thinking twice. Now, his voice faded before he finished the sentence. I waited patiently. Now everything feels different, he admitted. I cannot tell whether I miss her or whether I just miss the life I thought we were going to have. His honesty hurt because I understood it so well. Sometimes people grieve dreams just as much as they grieve people. He looked directly at me. What would you do? That simple question carried more weight than he realized. For one impossible moment, I wanted to answer with complete honesty. I wanted to tell him not to go because every day he spent rebuilding his heart had quietly rebuilt mine as well. I wanted to tell him that the happiest months of my life had been the ordinary mornings, shared dinners, and peaceful evenings we created together without realizing they already looked like a home. Instead, I took a slow breath and chose the answer a best friend was supposed to give. Meet her, I said calmly. Ethan frowned slightly. Really? I nodded. You do not have to forgive her. You do not have to take her back. But if you still have questions, avoiding the conversation will not answer them. He stared at me for several quiet seconds before asking, You are sure? I forced a small smile. I think people deserve the chance to say what they came to say. After that, you can decide what belongs in your future. Relief slowly appeared across his face. Thank you, he whispered. I knew you would tell me the truth. Those words should have made me feel proud. Instead, they quietly broke something inside me because the truth I gave him was only half of the truth I carried. That afternoon, Ethan left to meet Claire while I stayed behind editing photographs I could barely focus on. Hours passed before my phone finally rang. It was my friend Olivia, who happened to work at the same marketing company where Claire had recently accepted a promotion. During our conversation, she casually mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. It is funny timing, Olivia said. Claire started asking about Ethan again right after everyone found out he was being considered for regional director at the fitness company. I stopped typing. What do you mean? Olivia hesitated before answering. She spent months acting like she had completely moved on. Then suddenly she wanted to know whether he was still single, how well his career was going, and whether he had finally bought a condo downtown. Maybe it means nothing, but the timing felt strange. After ending the call, I sat perfectly still staring at the dark computer screen. A quiet feeling settled deep inside my chest, not jealousy, but concern. If Olivia was right, Claire had not returned because Ethan was still broken. She had returned because Ethan had finally become whole again. When Ethan walked back into the apartment later that evening, he looked thoughtful rather than happy. He quietly removed his jacket before looking at me with uncertain eyes and speaking the words I had feared all afternoon. She asked if we could try again. The apartment felt different after Ethan spoke those words. She asked if we could try again. They echoed through the room long after the silence returned. I looked at him and forced myself to remain calm, even though my heart seemed determined to remind me how dangerous hope could be. Ethan slowly sat down on the couch where he had spent his very first night after the breakup. Our dog immediately jumped beside him, resting his head across Ethan's lap as though trying to comfort him without understanding why. Ethan gently scratched behind the dog's ears before letting out a long breath. I told her I needed time, he admitted. I could not answer right away. I nodded quietly. That was probably the right decision. He looked toward me with the same uncertain expression he had worn months earlier. I keep thinking about everything you helped me understand. About forgiveness. About not letting one painful chapter decide the rest of my life. Hearing my own advice repeated back to me felt strangely bittersweet. I had offered those words hoping they would help him become whole again. I had never imagined they might become the bridge leading him back to someone else. Ethan continued speaking, unaware of the quiet battle inside me. You told me people can grow. You told me everyone deserves the chance to become better than the worst mistake they ever made. I smiled faintly. I still believe that. He lowered his eyes for a moment. Then maybe Claire deserves that chance too. Those words settled between us like a door slowly closing. I wanted to tell him about Olivia's phone call. I wanted to explain that Claire's sudden return seemed strangely connected to his recent promotion and the stability he had worked so hard to rebuild. But nothing I could say would sound objective anymore. It would sound like jealousy, no matter how carefully I chose my words. Ethan trusted me because I had never asked him to choose me over anyone else. I refused to lose that trust now. The following week passed with quiet uncertainty. Ethan met Claire several more times, always returning thoughtful rather than excited. Meanwhile, our routines continued almost exactly the same. We still shared breakfast before work. We still walked our dog every evening through the neighborhood park. We still laughed at old movies neither of us had seen before. Yet every familiar moment carried a strange awareness that it might soon disappear. One evening, while I was editing photographs in the living room, Ethan walked in carrying a small paper bag from my favorite bakery. "Your cinnamon rolls," he said with a smile. They were fresh out of the oven. I thanked him as naturally as I always had, but something inside me quietly wondered how many more ordinary evenings like this remained. As we ate together, Ethan suddenly looked at me with unexpected gratitude. "You know," he said softly, "everything good I have done these past few months started because you refused to let me give up on myself." I looked down at the table. "You did the hard part." He slowly shook his head. "No, you reminded me who I was before I forgot." A few days later, Ethan asked if we could take our dog to the lakeshore before sunset. We watched the waves roll gently onto the shore while the city skyline glowed behind us. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I made my decision. My heartbeat became almost painfully loud. Ethan smiled with quiet certainty. "I told Claire I am willing to give us another chance." For a brief second, the world around me seemed to stop moving. Then he reached over and squeezed my shoulder warmly. "I could only do it because of you, Mason. You taught me how to heal. You gave me back the strength to believe and love again." He smiled with complete sincerity, believing he had just given me the greatest compliment imaginable. He never realized that every word of gratitude felt like watching someone gently hand away the very future I had quietly dreamed of, using the heart I had spent months helping him rebuild. The morning after Ethan told me he was giving Claire another chance, I woke before sunrise even though I had barely slept. The apartment was completely quiet except for the soft breathing of our dog sleeping near the couch, where Ethan had spent so many nights during the hardest months of his life. For a long moment, I simply stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, realizing something I had refused to admit until then. If I stayed exactly where I was, nothing in Ethan's life would truly change. Claire would become part of his future, and I would quietly remain the dependable best friend who smiled through every celebration while pretending my own heart was perfectly fine. I could not spend the rest of my life living inside a role that slowly erased me. That afternoon, I accepted a phone call from my photography agent, who had been trying for weeks to convince me to take a documentary assignment in Seattle. It was a 6-month project photographing neighborhoods, local artists, and community events across the Pacific Northwest. I had declined the offer twice because I did not want to leave Ethan while he was still recovering. Now the situation had changed. "Is the position still available?" I asked. My agent sounded pleasantly surprised. "It is. Are you finally ready?" I looked around my apartment before quietly answering. "Yes, I think I am." Over the next several days, I began packing little by little whenever Ethan was at work or spending time with Claire. I told myself it was only practical. The assignment represented an opportunity one had earned through years of hard work, yet every folded shirt and packed camera lens felt like another quiet goodbye. Ethan noticed the boxes sooner than I expected. One evening, he walked into the apartment carrying groceries and stopped in the middle of the living room. "Why are there moving boxes?" he asked with obvious confusion. I took a slow breath before answering. "I accepted a photography project in Seattle. It starts next month." He stared at me as though he had misunderstood the words. "For how long?" "About 6 months." He set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter without taking his eyes off me. Why did you not tell me you were thinking about leaving? I offered a small, tired smile. Because I was not thinking about it before. Ethan looked genuinely unsettled. But everything is finally getting better. I nodded gently. Exactly. You are doing well. You have Claire again. You are moving forward. That means I finally have room to move forward too. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Later, that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I continued sorting old photography equipment stored in the hallway closet. Tucked behind one of the shelves was a small cardboard box I had almost forgotten existed. Curious, I opened it and immediately froze. Inside were hundreds of printed photographs collected over the past 4 years. None of them had been taken for clients. Every single picture was of Ethan. There were photographs of him laughing while burning pancakes during our first camping trip, reading quietly beneath a tree in the city park, playing with our dog on snowy mornings, cheering me on during my first gallery exhibition, and smiling across countless ordinary dinners we had shared together. Without ever planning it, I had documented nearly every meaningful moment we experienced side by side. I gently closed the box, intending to pack it with the rest of my belongings before Ethan returned from work the following afternoon. But the next morning I received an urgent message from a client asking me to meet downtown immediately to finalize travel arrangements. I left the apartment in a hurry, accidentally leaving the forgotten box sitting on the hallway floor exactly where I had opened it. As the apartment door quietly closed behind me, I had no idea that Ethan would come home early that afternoon, walk past the hallway, notice the photographs scattered inside the open box, and unknowingly discover a story I had spent years trying to hide from everyone, including him. When I returned to the apartment that evening, the first thing I noticed was the cardboard box sitting on the dining table instead of the hallway floor where I had accidentally left it. Every photograph had been stacked neatly back inside, except one. Ethan sat quietly on the couch holding a single picture in both hands. It was taken 3 summers earlier during a weekend camping trip. He was laughing beside a campfire while looking directly toward my camera, completely unaware that I had stopped photographing the scenery long before I started photographing him. He slowly looked up as I stepped inside. "How long?" he asked softly. I already knew what he meant. I set my camera bag near the door and answered with the only truth I had left. Long enough that I stopped counting. Silence settled between us. Ethan lowered his eyes to the photograph again before opening the box. One by one he lifted the pictures, studying moments I had never intended anyone else to see. There were birthdays, road trips, ordinary grocery runs, rainy afternoons with our dog asleep between us, and quiet evenings when he had smiled without realizing I had captured the moment forever. None of the photographs had been staged. Every one of them showed the life we had quietly built together while he believed I was simply documenting memories. "You never told me," he whispered. I smiled sadly. "Because you never asked." He closed the box carefully, his expression filled with emotions I could not yet understand. "Why would you carry this alone?" I walked toward the window, overlooking the city lights before answering. "Because loving someone does not give you the right to ask them for the same feeling in return." Ethan remained completely still. "Mason," I gently interrupted him. "You came to me because your heart belonged to someone else. I accepted that before you ever knocked on my door." The words were calm, but speaking them aloud somehow made years of hidden emotions feel real for the first time. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. Claire's name appeared across the screen. He hesitated before answering. I quietly stepped onto the apartment balcony, giving him privacy while the cool evening air drifted across the skyline. Through the slightly open door, I could not hear every word, but I recognized the changing tone in his voice. At first he sounded confused, then thoughtful, finally, unusually quiet. Nearly 20 minutes later, he joined me outside, still holding his phone loosely at his side. "Claire asked me something today," he said. I waited patiently. He looked out across the city before continuing. "She asked why every story I tell somehow ends with your name in it." My heartbeat slowed. Ethan gave a faint, uncertain laugh. "She said whenever something good happens, the first person I want to tell is you. Whenever something goes wrong, the first person I run to is you. She asked why I smile differently when I talk about you than when I talk about anyone else." He looked down at the photograph still resting in his hand. I told her she was imagining things. His voice almost disappeared. She looked at me and said, Then why do you miss him every time you are sitting beside me? Neither of us spoke after that. The city lights shimmered beneath the darkening sky, while the question lingered between us, unanswered yet impossible to ignore. For the first time since Claire returned, it was no longer my hidden feelings that stood between us. It was the possibility that Ethan had finally begun questioning the truth his own heart had been trying to tell him all along. The following morning arrived with an unfamiliar quiet that neither Ethan nor I knew how to break. We moved carefully through the apartment as though every ordinary routine had suddenly become fragile. I prepared coffee while he filled our dog's food bowl. We exchanged polite smiles, but the easy comfort that had once defined our mornings had been replaced by thoughtful silence. Neither of us mentioned the photographs. Neither of us mentioned Claire. Yet both subjects lingered between us with every passing minute. 2 days later, Ethan asked if we could meet after work at the small park where we often walked our dog. Autumn leaves drifted across the winding paths as families enjoyed the cool afternoon. Children laughed in the distance, and joggers passed beneath rows of golden trees. Ethan stood waiting beside the lake with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The moment I reached him, I realized something had changed. His expression no longer carried confusion. It carried certainty mixed with regret. We began walking slowly along the shoreline, while our dog happily explored every fallen leaf. After several quiet minutes, Ethan finally spoke. "Claire ended things yesterday." I looked at him in surprise. "I thought you wanted to try again." He nodded slowly. "So did I." His voice remained calm. "But she asked me one question that I could not answer honestly." I already knew which question he meant. Ethan smiled sadly. "She asked whether I was trying to rebuild our relationship because I truly loved her, or because I was afraid of letting go of the future I had imagined." He paused before continuing. "Then she told me something I never expected to hear." I listened quietly. She said she could never compete with the person I already trusted with every important part of my life. Ethan looked toward the calm water before adding, "She thanked me for being honest, even though I had not been honest with myself until that moment." We continued walking until we reached the wooden pier overlooking the lake. The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the water, creating gentle waves of gold beneath the fading sky. Ethan rested both hands on the railing and took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." I remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "When my heart was broken, I came to you because I knew you would never let me fall apart." His eyes lowered. "You gave me safety, patience, friendship, and more kindness than I deserved. Then I used everything you helped me rebuild to walk back towards someone else." Every word came without excuses, without self-pity, only quiet responsibility. I did not understand what I was doing until it was already hurting you. I felt the weight of those months settle gently between us. "You were not trying to hurt me," I answered softly. Ethan nodded. "No, but I still did." He looked directly into my eyes for the first time since discovering the photographs. "The hardest part is realizing that I kept calling your apartment home long before I ever understood why it felt that way." My heart wanted to believe him immediately, but another part of me remembered every sleepless night, every hidden feeling, and every goodbye I had already prepared myself to survive. I took a careful breath before answering. "Ethan, loving someone is not the same as needing someone after a heartbreak." He listened without interrupting. "You spent months depending on me while you healed. I cannot become another place you run to simply because your relationship ended again." He slowly nodded, accepting every word. "You are right." The honesty in his voice surprised me. "I am not asking you to forgive me today." He offered a small, sincere smile. "I am asking for the chance to become someone who does not need to be rescued anymore." As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, we walked back toward the parking lot in thoughtful silence. For the first time since the night Ethan knocked on my apartment door carrying an unopened engagement ring, neither of us was trying to save the other. Whatever happened next would have to be built not on heartbreak, gratitude, or loneliness, but on two people finally willing to face the truth with nothing left hidden between them. 3 weeks passed without either of us trying to force an answer to questions that deserved more than a single emotional conversation. I continued preparing for my photography assignment in Seattle, confirming travel dates, organizing equipment, and accepting that leaving Chicago was still the right decision. Ethan never asked me to cancel the project again. Instead, he quietly respected the boundary I had finally drawn, even though I could see how difficult that was for him. He stopped assuming we would automatically spend every evening together and began rebuilding his own routine without leaning on mine. For the first time since Claire left him, he was learning how to stand completely on his own. Oddly enough, watching him become independent made me respect him even more. One Saturday morning, while packing camera lenses into protective cases, I heard the apartment doorbell ring. Ethan opened it before I reached the hallway. Standing outside was Claire. She smiled politely when she saw me and asked whether we could talk for a few minutes. I immediately offered to give them privacy, but she gently shook her head. "Actually," she said kindly, "I would rather both of you hear this." We sat together in the living room where months earlier Ethan had first arrived carrying the unopened engagement ring. Claire looked calm, almost relieved. "I wanted to apologize," she began. She turned toward me first. "Not because I ended my relationship with Ethan. That was our responsibility to figure out. I am apologizing because I came back after he had already healed, without asking myself whether I loved the person standing in front of me or the future he represented." She lowered her eyes for a moment before continuing. "Meeting him again made me realize something uncomfortable. Every meaningful story he shared somehow included you. Every happy memory from the past year had your name in it. I finally understood I was asking him to return to a relationship while the safest place in his heart already belonged somewhere else." Ethan remained silent, listening carefully. Claire smiled gently at him. "You were honest with me once you understood yourself, and I appreciate that. We both deserve relationships where nobody has to wonder whether they came second." She stood, thanked us for listening, and quietly left the apartment. The room stayed silent long after the door closed. Ethan looked toward me, but did not move any closer. "A few months ago," he said softly, "I would have begged her not to leave again. I waited. Today I felt grateful that she told the truth before either of us wasted more time pretending." I nodded slowly. "Sometimes letting go is the kindest choice." He smiled faintly. "I finally understand what you meant when you said healing is not the same as love." During the following days, Ethan never mentioned relationships again. Instead, he focused on work, returned to coaching community fitness classes on weekends, and even signed up to mentor younger trainers entering the profession. Watching him choose growth without expecting anything from me confirmed something important. He was no longer asking me to repair the pieces of his life. He was learning to build them himself. The evening before my flight to Seattle, we took our dog for one last walk along the river. The skyline reflected across the water exactly as it had on countless evenings before, yet everything felt different. Ethan stopped near the bridge where we had once laughed about strangers assuming we were a couple. He looked across the city lights before speaking with quiet certainty. "I am not asking you to stay." I looked at him in surprise. He smiled warmly. "Because if what I feel is real, then it should be strong enough to wait until you come back. I do not want you to choose me because you feel guilty about leaving. I want you to chase the dream you worked for long before I understood my own heart." His words carried no desperation, only quiet confidence. As we continued walking beneath the autumn sky, I realized the man beside me was no longer searching for someone else to save him. He had finally become the person I had always believed he could be, and for the first time, that gave me hope instead of fear. Seattle welcomed me with endless gray skies, salty ocean air, and a pace of life completely different from Chicago. My photography assignment quickly filled every day with new neighborhoods, unfamiliar faces, and stories waiting to be captured through my camera. I spent mornings documenting local markets, afternoons following community artists, and evenings editing thousands of photographs inside a small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The work challenged me in ways I had always hoped it would. For the first time in years, my world no longer revolved around waiting for someone else's happiness to determine my own. I still missed Ethan, but the ache slowly changed into something quieter, no longer a wound, but a memory learning how to breathe. We kept in touch, although very differently than before. Instead of talking every hour, we exchanged thoughtful messages every few days. Ethan never asked when I was coming home, and I never asked whether he regretted anything. We spoke about ordinary life instead. He told me about the young trainers he had begun mentoring at the community fitness center, the charity marathon he helped organize, and the funny things our dog did whenever someone accidentally left a tennis ball within reach. I shared photographs of Seattle sunsets, crowded ferry docks, mountain trails, and the small neighborhood cafe where the owner had learned my name after only 2 weeks. Our conversations no longer depended on heartbreak or emotional rescue. They simply reflected two people learning how to know each other honestly. Nearly 4 months into my assignment, I received an unexpected email from a respected photography gallery inviting me to participate in a regional exhibition featuring emerging documentary artists. I stared at the message for several minutes before finally believing it was real. The exhibition would display 12 of my favorite photographs from Seattle, representing the most important opportunity of my career. That evening I called Ethan to share the news. Before I could finish explaining, he interrupted with unmistakable excitement. "I knew this would happen," he said immediately. I laughed. "You sound more excited than I do." "That is because I have been watching you doubt yourself for years," he answered warmly. "It is about time the rest of the world sees what I have always seen." His words stayed with me long after we ended the call. They did not feel like someone trying to win forgiveness. They felt like someone genuinely celebrating another person's success without expecting anything in return. A week before the exhibition opened, a package arrived at my apartment. Inside was a simple leather-bound journal and a handwritten note from Ethan. The first page contained only one sentence. "Fill this with every place that teaches you who you are when nobody needs saving." I slowly turned the remaining blank pages, understanding the meaning behind the gift. For years, my camera had documented everyone else's stories while I quietly disappeared behind the lens. Ethan was encouraging me to record my own life for the first time. On the evening of the exhibition, visitors slowly filled the gallery, pausing thoughtfully before each photograph. I answered questions, shared stories behind the images, and gradually realized that I no longer introduced myself as someone standing in another person's shadow. I was finally becoming the artist I had dreamed of being. Just before the event ended, my phone vibrated gently inside my pocket. There was no dramatic message, no urgent confession, and no desperate request. Ethan had simply sent a photograph of our dog sitting patiently beside the apartment window in Chicago, looking toward the evening skyline. Beneath the picture he had written, "Someone is waiting for his favorite photographer to come home whenever the journey is finished. There is no rush. We will still be here." Reading those words beneath the quiet lights of the gallery, I realized that the strongest promises are often the ones that never ask you to choose between love and becoming the person you were always meant to be. 6 months passed more quickly than I expected. By the time winter began giving way to the first signs of spring, Seattle no longer felt unfamiliar. I knew which cafe opened before sunrise, which ferry offered the most beautiful morning light, and which streets filled with musicians every Friday evening. My photography project had become more than an assignment. It had become proof that I could build a life without waiting for permission to believe in myself. Yet no matter how much I grew, one thought quietly remained with me. Growth did not erase love. It simply taught me the difference between loving someone and losing myself because of them. A week before my return flight to Chicago, the gallery director invited me to lunch with several photographers whose work I had admired for years. During the conversation, one of them smiled and asked what had inspired the emotional honesty behind my photographs. I thought carefully before answering. Someone once taught me that the strongest moments are usually the quiet ones. I finally learned to point my camera toward those instead of waiting for dramatic endings. As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized they were true. Ethan had unknowingly changed not only my heart, but also the way I saw the world through my lens. When my assignment officially ended, I packed the same camera cases I had carried across the country months earlier. This time, however, they felt lighter. Before leaving the apartment, I opened the leather journal Ethan had given me. Every page was now filled with handwritten memories, sketches of places I had visited, and small reflections about the person I was becoming. On the final page, I wrote one sentence before closing the cover. I finally learned that coming home only matters after you have discovered who you are. My flight landed in Chicago on a cool Saturday afternoon. I expected nothing more than collecting my luggage, calling a taxi, and quietly settling back into ordinary life. As I stepped through the arrival gate, I immediately recognized familiar golden fur weaving excitedly through the crowd. Our dog raced toward me so enthusiastically that I nearly dropped my camera bag while laughing. A moment later, Ethan appeared several steps behind him, holding the leash with the same calm smile I remembered from before I left. He looked different somehow, not because of his appearance, but because of the quiet confidence in the way he stood. There was no urgency in his expression, no fear that I might disappear again. He simply looked happy to see me. "Welcome home," he said warmly. I knelt to hug our excited companion before standing again. "I thought you said there was no rush." Ethan laughed softly. "There was not. I was already here anyway." On the drive back into the city, he asked about Seattle, my exhibition, and the journal before telling me stories about the young trainers he continued mentoring and the charity programs that had grown far beyond what he originally imagined. We spent nearly an hour talking without mentioning heartbreak, Claire, or the past. Somewhere along the highway, I realized we were no longer carrying old versions of ourselves into the conversation. That evening, Ethan invited me to dinner at the little neighborhood restaurant where months earlier we had celebrated nothing more than surviving another difficult week together. As we walked inside, the same waitress recognized us immediately and smiled with genuine warmth. "It has been a long time," she said while leading us to our usual table. "I am glad to see you two together again." Ethan glanced toward me before quietly answering, "So am I." There was no hesitation in his voice this time. No uncertainty hidden beneath the words. Only quiet gratitude for the journey that had finally allowed both of us to stand beside each other as equals, no longer one person rescuing the other, but two people who had each learned how to become whole on their own. 1 year later, I found myself standing inside my newest photography exhibition in downtown Chicago, surrounded by images that quietly told the story of people discovering hope in ordinary places. Families wandered through the gallery, couples paused in front of framed photographs, and children pointed excitedly toward colorful city scenes captured through my lens. Watching strangers connect with moments I had once experienced alone filled me with a sense of gratitude I could never have imagined during the night Ethan first knocked on my apartment door, carrying a future that had fallen apart. Near the center of the exhibition stood my favorite photograph, a peaceful sunrise reflected across Elliott Bay in Seattle. Beneath it hung a simple title, "Finding Home." Visitors often asked why I chose that name, and every time I smiled before answering that home was never only a place. Sometimes it was the person who quietly helped you become yourself without asking you to stay the same forever. As the evening continued, I noticed Ethan walking through the gallery with our dog calmly waiting beside him on a leash, greeting guests who smiled at the friendly golden retriever. He stopped in front of every photograph, reading each description carefully as though he wanted to understand not only what I had captured, but also who I had become while I was away. When the final visitors slowly began leaving, the gallery finally grew quiet. Ethan walked toward me carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "You earned every bit of this." I thanked him before carefully opening the package. Inside was the same velvet ring box he had carried to my apartment on that rainy night more than a year earlier. For a brief moment, I simply stared at it without speaking. Ethan smiled gently. "Do not worry. There is no ring inside." I slowly opened the box and found only a folded note resting where the ring had once been. In careful handwriting he had written, "I carried this box because I thought it represented the future I lost. Today I am giving it away because it reminds me that holding on to the wrong future almost made me miss the right one." I looked up, unable to hide the emotion in my eyes. Ethan took a slow breath before continuing. "I spent a long time believing love was finding someone who would stay after everything went wrong. Then I realized love was also becoming the kind of person worthy of standing beside someone without asking them to save me." The gallery remained completely silent except for the soft sound of our dog settling comfortably near our feet. I reached into my camera bag and removed the leather journal Ethan had given me before Seattle. Tucked inside the final page was the photograph I had never shown anyone. It was the first picture I had taken of Ethan years earlier, laughing beneath the afternoon sunlight without knowing my camera was focused entirely on him. I placed it in his hands. "This was where my story began," I said quietly. Ethan studied the photograph before smiling with quiet understanding. "Then maybe we can begin the next chapter together." There were no dramatic promises, no grand speeches, and no need to rush toward an ending. I simply reached for his hand, and this time neither of us let go. As we stepped outside the gallery beneath a clear Chicago evening sky, our dog happily walking beside us, I realized the greatest lesson our journey had given me was beautifully simple. Real love is not measured by who arrives when your heart is broken. It is measured by who quietly grows beside you until both of you become strong enough to choose each other freely, honestly, and every single day thereafter.